Our HOA president just crossed the line. Karen completely lost it. She demanded that every household pay $250,000 immediately or face foreclosure. When my wife calmly said, "I refuse," Karen started screaming and even called 911 claiming, "We were dangerous." I was panicking, thinking the police were about to arrest us until my wife reached into her purse, pulled out what looked like a regular ID card, and handed it to the officer. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. Then his entire face went white and his whole attitude toward her changed in an instant. But before I tell you what happened next, let me back up, because you need to understand how insane this meeting really was. It was a Tuesday evening in our quiet neighborhood of Sunset Hills. My wife, Rebecca, and I had only lived there for 3 months. We thought the HOA meeting would be the usual stuff: lawn rules, pool repairs, maybe parking complaints. Instead, it was a financial ambush. The community center was packed. 60 people crammed into a room meant for 30. At the front table sat Karen Whitfield, our HOA president, tapping her perfectly manicured nails like a queen holding court. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and with a smug grin announced, "Every household will contribute $250,000 toward our premium landscaping project. Payments are due in 30 days. Non-negotiable." The room gasped. People were horrified. One elderly widow, Mrs. Martinez, stood up trembling. She said she'd already paid Karen $45,000 last year for emergency roof repairs that never happened. She was eating crackers and soup just to survive. Karen's response? A cruel eye roll. Then she said, "Perhaps you should have been more financially responsible. If you can't contribute, maybe assisted living is more appropriate." The entire room froze. That's when I felt Rebecca tense beside me. And here's what Karen didn't know. Rebecca isn't just a military spouse. She's Brigadier General Rebecca Thompson Martinez, retired. 22 years of service, multiple deployments, and military intelligence experience. She's seen war zones, and nothing makes her angrier than watching the vulnerable get bullied. Rebecca stood up, calm but commanding. She looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "I refuse to pay this fee, period." Karen's face turned purple. She pointed her finger, screeching about military wives needing to understand civilian authority. And then, because she thrives on drama, she called 911 right there in front of everyone, accusing us of being aggressive, hostile, and dangerous. Minutes later, Detective Jake Morrison arrived. You could tell instantly he was former military by his stance and tone. Karen rushed to him, ranting about government intimidation. He listened politely, then asked for IDs. Rebecca calmly handed him her military identification. Morrison looked at it, froze, and then, before the entire crowd snapped to attention, saluted and said, "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" The room went dead silent. Karen's jaw literally dropped. Her face went pale as she stammered, "That's not, she can't, this isn't..." But it was too late. Rebecca had already opened her folder of evidence. Documentation of Karen's shady financial demands, missing funds, and complaints from multiple residents. Mrs. Martinez even found her voice and revealed how Karen scammed her out of $45,000 with fake contractors. Detective Morrison's notes grew longer and sharper. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was elder abuse and fraud. Karen, in desperation, played her political card. She shouted that her brother was Congressman Robert Whitfield and that he'd protect her. She tried to frame herself as the victim of a military conspiracy, but what she didn't expect? The truth about her own past. With some quick research on my phone, I discovered Karen wasn't new to corruption. She was dishonorably discharged from the Army 12 years ago for embezzling funds meant for soldiers' families. And now, she was repeating the same scam in our neighborhood. As Morrison questioned her, the certainty in Karen's eyes started to crumble. She was no longer in control. Rebecca had exposed her, Mrs. Martinez had spoken up, and the entire neighborhood was watching. And Karen's final mistake, the phone call she made during the meeting, would end up revealing something far bigger than any of us imagined. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happens next will shock you. Karen thought she was untouchable, but the truth is about to catch up with her. Martinez's chair and said quietly, "Ma'am, what happened to you was wrong and it's not going to happen again. I promise you that." The way she said it, calm, determined, absolute, gave me chills. This wasn't just personal anymore for Rebecca. This was a mission. Tyler approached us after the meeting broke up, and he was practically buzzing with excitement. "That was incredible," he said, showing us his phone. "The recording has 5,000 views already, and people are sharing stories about Karen's harassment going back years. Did you know she's forced 6 military families to move out of the neighborhood in the past 3 years? Every single one of them left, after mysterious special assessments and harassment campaigns. The drive home was quiet at first, both of us processing what had just happened. Then Rebecca broke the silence with something that made my heart race. "Logan, I need to tell you something. I've been documenting Karen's behavior since our second week here. Something about her tactics reminded me of psychological operations I'd seen overseas. She's not just a power-hungry HOA president. She knows what she's doing, and she's done it before. She showed me a folder she'd been building, copies of violations that cited non-existent regulations, photos of Karen watching our house at odd hours, and records of complaints filed against military families that followed an identical pattern. My wife had been conducting a counterintelligence operation against our HOA president, and I'd had no idea. Rebecca, this is evidence of systematic harassment. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to be sure," she said in that careful way she had when dealing with classified situations. "And because I knew that once I took action, there would be no going back." Karen picked the wrong target, but she's not going to give up easily. This is about to get much worse before it gets better. As if summoned by her words, my phone rang with the school district's number. Dr. Patterson, my principal, was calling at 9 at night, which was unusual enough to make my stomach drop. "Logan, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I've received some concerning complaints about your conduct as a teacher. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning to discuss allegations of inappropriate political indoctrination and unprofessional behavior." McCarran had wasted no time launching her counterattack, and she'd gone straight for my career. The woman was smarter and more vindictive than I'd given her credit for. She'd researched us enough to know that threatening my job would hit where it hurt most. Rebecca saw my face and immediately understood what was happening. She's escalating because she feels cornered. Rebecca said, her military mind already analyzing the tactical situation. This means we're getting close to something she doesn't want exposed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Martinez's tears, Karen's smug confidence, and the way Morrison's expression had changed when he saw Rebecca's ID. There were pieces to this puzzle that I wasn't seeing yet, but I could feel them moving beneath the surface. Rebecca was right. This was about to get much worse. I got up and went to my computer, determined to find out everything I could about Karen Whitfield's military service and the circumstances of her discharge. What I discovered in those classified military records would change everything we thought we knew about our neighborhood HOA president. Why was Karen's discharge classified, and what is she really hiding? The classified military records I uncovered that night were absolutely explosive, and I mean that literally. Karen Whitfield hadn't just been discharged for simple embezzlement. She'd been involved in a massive fraud scheme that had endangered active military operations. According to the documents I managed to access through Rebecca's security clearance, Karen had been stealing funds allocated for essential equipment and supplies, including communications gear and protective equipment for soldiers in combat zones. 3 soldiers had died in an ambush, partly because their unit lacked the radio equipment that should have been purchased with the money Karen stole for her personal shopping sprees. The case had been classified not to protect Karen, but to prevent details about military supply chain vulnerabilities from becoming public knowledge. The Army had quietly discharged her and banned her from all military installations, but they couldn't prosecute without revealing operational security information. Karen had essentially gotten away with causing soldier deaths because the alternative was compromising national security. The rage I felt reading those files was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Rebecca took the news with the kind of controlled fury that scared me more than any explosion would have. "She's not just a bully," Rebecca said, her voice deadly quiet. "She's responsible for soldiers dying, and she's been using her knowledge of military psychology to systematically destroy military families ever since. This isn't random harassment. This is revenge against the institution that held her accountable." The school board meeting the next morning was a nightmare designed by Karen's twisted mind. She'd filed complaints that painted me as a radical teacher using my classroom to indoctrinate students with anti-authority propaganda. She'd somehow obtained recordings of class discussions where I had encouraged students to question government policies and think critically about civic responsibility. Out of context, they sounded like seditious rants rather than standard civics education. Dr. Patterson was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, but she had to take parent complaints seriously. Karen had mobilized a group of mothers who claimed their children were being taught to disrespect law enforcement and military hierarchy. The irony was breathtaking. A woman who had stolen from soldiers was accusing me of being anti-military, but her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Attack my credibility before I could expose her criminal past. "Mr. Martinez, these are serious allegations," Dr. Patterson said, sliding a folder of complaints across her desk. "Parents are claiming you're encouraging students to challenge legitimate authority and promoting dangerous ideologies. We need to investigate thoroughly before this becomes a media circus." I could see the position she was in. Better to suspend one teacher than deal with a community uprising orchestrated by a congressman's sister. Karen's next move showed just how well she understood psychological warfare. She started offering deals to non-military families in the neighborhood. Reduced assessments, delayed payment schedules, even complete exemptions for families willing to support her against the troublemaking military elements. She was deliberately fracturing our community along military versus civilian lines, using financial pressure to force neighbors to choose sides. Mrs. Martinez became an unexpected hero in this psychological battlefield. Despite Karen's intimidation tactics and offers of financial assistance if she'd recant her elder abuse claims, she refused to back down. "I may be old, but I'm not stupid," she told Rebecca and me when we checked on her. "That woman thinks she can buy my silence after stealing my money. She's got another thing coming." The determination in this elderly lady's voice was absolutely inspiring. Tyler's documentation became crucial evidence as Karen's harassment campaign intensified. His recording showed a clear pattern of behavior that went far beyond normal HOA disputes. Karen was systematically targeting military families with impossible standards, frivolous violations, and financial demands that were clearly designed to force them out. The footage of her literally measuring grass height with a ruler to issue citations for violations measured in fractions of inches was both hilarious and damning. Morrison called Rebecca with an update that made everything click into place. His investigation had revealed that 6 military families had been forced to leave the neighborhood in the past 3 years, each following an identical pattern of harassment. What made it even more suspicious was that all 6 families had sold their homes at below-market prices to the same real estate investment company, a company owned by Karen's ex-husband. "She's been running a real estate scam," Morrison explained. "Force out military families buy their houses cheap, then flip them for massive profits. The HOA fees she's collecting aren't going toward community improvements. They're funding her lifestyle while she systematically looted the neighborhood." Yet the scope of Karen's criminal enterprise was staggering, and it explained why she was fighting so hard to maintain control. Rebecca's breaking point came during a confrontation at the grocery store that I'll never forget. Karen approached us in the produce section with this smug smile and started loudly complaining about military families who think they're above civilian law. "Some people need to learn that rank doesn't matter outside the military," she said, speaking loudly enough for other shoppers to hear. "Government employees who intimidate private citizens should face consequences." That's when my calm, controlled, professional wife finally snapped. Rebecca turned around and faced Karen directly, and I could see 22 years of military authority radiating from her posture. "You picked the wrong veteran to mess with," she said, her voice carrying that command, presence that made enemy combatants surrender. "I've dealt with terrorists and war criminals who were more honorable than you. You're about to learn what happens when you target American soldiers and their families. The grocery store went dead silent. Other shoppers stopped us and stared as these two women faced off between the tomatoes and lettuce. Karen's confidence cracked for just a moment, and I saw genuine fear flash across her face before her entitled rage reasserted itself. "Are you threatening me?" she shrieked. Everyone heard that this military person just threatened a civilian, but the other shoppers weren't buying Karen's performance anymore. Word had spread through the community about the HOA meeting. Tyler's recordings were being shared, and people were starting to connect the dots about Karen's behavior. An elderly gentleman stepped forward and said, "Lady, I saw the recording of what you said to that poor old woman. You should be ashamed of yourself." And other voices joined in supporting Rebecca and condemning Karen's treatment of Mrs. Martinez. Karen fled the grocery store in humiliation, but I knew this was far from over. She'd been publicly challenged and embarrassed, which would only make her more dangerous. That evening, Rebecca received a call that made both of us realize just how serious the situation had become. "Mrs. Martinez." "What's wrong?" Rebecca asked, putting the call on speaker so I could hear. "Karen came to my house tonight," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice shaking. "She offered me $50,000 to drop the complaints and say I misunderstood what happened. When I refused, she said terrible things about what happens to old ladies who don't know when to keep quiet. Rebecca, I'm scared. I've never been scared in my own home before." Rebecca's face went through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. Concern, rage, determination, and finally cold calculation. "Mrs. Martinez, pack a bag. You're staying with us tonight, and tomorrow we're going to end this once and for all." She hung up and immediately started making calls to people whose names I recognized from her military contacts. That night, while Mrs. Martinez slept safely in our guest room, Rebecca worked late into the morning. She was building what she called an intelligence package, a comprehensive dossier of Karen's criminal activities, financial fraud, and harassment campaigns. "I've been playing defense," she told me. "Time to go on the offensive." The next morning, Karen received a federal audit notice in her mailbox. When she called her brother in a panic, his response wasn't what she expected. Instead of offering political protection, Robert's first words were pure terror. "Karen, what have you done now?" he whispered. Their conversation, which Tyler happened to record from his bedroom window overlooking Karen's front yard, revealed a family secret that would destroy them both. What secret did these siblings share that could destroy them both? Tyler's recording of Karen's panicked phone call with her congressman brother revealed something that made my blood run cold. Through his enhanced audio equipment, the kid was serious about his content creation. We could hear Robert Whitfield saying, "The military contracts, Karen, if they investigate those, we're both finished. You promised me you could handle this quietly." Karen's response was even more damning. "It's not my fault these military people won't play by the rules. They're supposed to be intimidated by authority, not fight back." The pieces were falling into place in the most horrifying way possible. Karen and her congressman brother had been running a military contracting scam for years. Robert used his position on the House Armed Services Committee to steer contracts toward companies Karen controlled, and she'd been overcharging the government for substandard equipment and services. The money she'd been stealing from our neighborhood wasn't just funding her lifestyle, it was keeping their criminal empire afloat. Tyler's content exploded overnight in a way that none of us had anticipated. His compilation video, which he titled HOA Karen vs. Military General, The Complete Breakdown, hit 25,000 views within hours. Comments started pouring in from military families across the country, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment and discrimination. Veterans were tagging friends, active duty members were sharing from overseas bases, and military spouses were organizing viewing parties to watch Karen's public humiliation. Local media picked up the story next, and suddenly we had news vans parked outside our neighborhood entrance. The angle they chose was perfect. President versus military general, the battle for Sunset Hills. Karen tried to control the narrative by hiring a crisis management firm, but their polished statements about community standards and fiscal responsibility couldn't compete with video, evidence of her threatening elderly veterans. Rebecca's intelligence training kicked into high gear as she systematically investigated Karen's financial network, using resources I didn't even know she had access to. She uncovered a web of shell companies, fraudulent contracts, and money laundering schemes that stretched back over a decade. "Logan, this is so much bigger than I thought," she told me, spreading documents across our dining room table. "Karen's been using her position here to test tactics she'd later use on military contracts. She's been practicing on us." The school board meeting that week became a public forum unlike anything our district had ever seen. Word had spread about my suspension, and instead of the usual handful of parents and school officials, the auditorium was packed with over 200 people. Military families, veterans, and community supporters filled every seat, and Tyler was live streaming the entire proceeding to his growing audience of 15,000 followers. Dr. Patterson tried to maintain order as she reviewed the complaints against me, but it quickly became clear that public opinion had shifted dramatically. Parent after parent stood up to defend my teaching methods and condemn Karen's harassment campaign. "Mr. Martinez didn't radicalize my daughter," said Own Mother. "He taught her to think critically and stand up for what's right. That's exactly what we need more of in our schools." Karen's damage control efforts were impressive in their sophistication. I'll give her that. She'd hired a professional public relations firm that specialized in crisis management for political figures. They crafted statements painting her as a dedicated community volunteer being targeted by an unhinged military couple with anger management issues. They even produced character witnesses who praised her commitment to neighborhood beautification and property values. But Tyler caught her in a moment of desperation that undid all her professional spin control. His camera was rolling when Karen was caught attempting to destroy HOA financial records behind the community center. She was literally feeding documents into a paper shredder while looking over her shoulder like a cartoon villain. "Oh my God, are you seeing this?" Tyler whispered to his live stream audience. "She's destroying evidence in real time." The financial evidence Logan had been uncovering painted a picture of systematic fraud that would make organized crime bosses jealous. Over $400,000 had disappeared from community funds over the past 5 years, all of it funneled through fake landscaping sewer tracks, phantom security services, and inflated maintenance costs. Every dollar had ultimately ended up in accounts controlled by Karen or her business partners. Morrison's investigation had attracted federal attention at this point, and agents from multiple agencies were coordinating what they called a multi-jurisdictional white-collar crime investigation. The FBI was handling the military contracting fraud. The IRS was tracking tax evasion, and the Postal Service was investigating mail fraud related to Karen's HOA schemes. The scope of law enforcement interest would have terrified any rational person, but Karen's narcissism seemed to protect her from understanding the gravity of her situation. Her final gambit showed both her intelligence and her complete lack of moral boundaries. Karen announced an emergency HOA meeting to vote on dissolving the organization entirely. Her logic was brutally simple. If there was no HOA, there could be no investigation into missing HOA funds. She'd liquidate everything, distribute the remaining assets to homeowners, and disappear into the sunset with her stolen money legally protected. The meeting she called was unlike anything our quiet neighborhood had ever experienced. Over 300 people packed into the community center, with overflow crowds watching Tyler's live stream from the parking lot. Karen showed up with her expensive lawyers and crisis management team, ready to railroad the dissolution vote through before anyone could organize opposition. Rebecca stood up during the public comment period, and I could see her shifting into full general mode. Her voice carried that unmistakable authority that had commanded respect in war zones and Pentagon briefings. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you vote to dissolve this organization, you need to understand what you're really voting on. You're voting on whether to let a criminal destroy evidence and escape justice." She presented a PowerPoint presentation that was like watching a military intelligence briefing. Financial charts, timeline analysis, documented patterns of fraud. Rebecca laid out the entire scope of Karen's criminal enterprise with the precision of a prosecutor presenting to a grand jury. The room was absolutely silent except for the occasional gasp of shocked recognition as residents saw their own experiences reflected in the data. Mrs. Martinez spoke next, and her testimony brought several people to tears. "This woman didn't just steal my money, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. She stole my sense of safety in my own home. She made him afraid to check my mail or answer my door. But Rebecca showed me that I don't have to be afraid of bullies no matter how powerful they think they are. Karen's attempt to call for an immediate vote was shouted down by residents demanding answers about missing funds. Her lawyers tried to invoke procedural rules to limit discussion, but the crowd wasn't having it. This was democracy in action, messy and loud, and absolutely beautiful to watch. Tyler's live stream audience had grown to 50,000 people, and comments were flying faster than anyone could read them. When federal agents appeared at the back of the community center with briefcases and badges, even Karen's crisis management team couldn't spin the optics. The lead agent approached the podium and asked to speak with Karen privately, but she refused to leave the public meeting. "I'm not hiding from trumped-up charges," she declared. "This is political persecution designed to silence community leaders who stand up to military intimidation." Morrison was coordinating with the federal task force by this point, and his next phone call changed everything we thought we knew about the timeline of this investigation. When he asked which agency was taking the lead, the answer made him visibly pale and spilled his coffee all over his paperwork. What has Karen really been involved in that requires that level of federal attention? Morrison's coffee spilling reaction was nothing compared to mine when he told us which federal agency was taking the lead on Karen's case. It wasn't just the FBI or IRS like we'd expected. It was the Department of Homeland Security, specifically their counterterrorism financial crimes unit. They think Karen's been laundering money for international criminal organizations. Morrison explained, his voice barely above a whisper. The military contracts were just the beginning. She's been moving money for some very dangerous people. And the 6-week federal investigation that culminated in action was like watching a precision military operation unfold in slow motion. Rebecca helped coordinate with investigators using her security clearance and intelligence background, providing context about Karen's psychological profile and tactical methods. "She's not just greedy," Rebecca explained to the federal team. "She's systematically targeting military families because she knows their deployment schedules, their financial vulnerabilities, and their reluctance to create public scenes that might affect security clearances." Tyler's documentation became crucial evidence in ways none of us had anticipated. His consistent filming over months had captured Karen's pattern of behavior in real time, creating an unbreakable timeline of harassment and fraud. Federal investigators told us later that Tyler's footage was some of the most comprehensive documentation of systematic fraud they'd ever seen from a civilian source. The kid who had started filming because he was bored during lockdown had accidentally created a federal case. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants traced Karen's money laundering operation back to its source. She'd been using HOA funds to purchase real estate, then selling those properties to shell companies controlled by foreign nationals under federal investigation for arms trafficking. Our quiet suburban neighborhood had been the American headquarters for an international criminal network, and Karen had been their financial operations manager. Mrs. Martinez's vindication was beautiful to watch unfold. Federal investigators confirmed that her $45,000 roof repair payment had been immediately transferred to an offshore account connected to weapons smuggling operations. The sweet elderly lady who'd been eating soup and crackers to survive had unknowingly funded international criminals, and Karen had been the mastermind who made it happen. My complete exoneration at the school district came with a formal apology and an offer of promotion to department head. The investigation had revealed that Karen's complaints were part of a coordinated attack designed to isolate and discredit me before I could expose her criminal activities. Dr. Patterson personally called to apologize for not recognizing the harassment campaign sooner. "Logan, we should have seen this pattern. You were being systematically targeted to silence your family." Tyler's platform reached 100,000 followers during this period, and his content evolved from neighborhood drama to serious investigative journalism. He'd attracted attention from real journalists who helped him verify information and expand his reach. Major news networks started featuring clips from his recordings, and his hashtag became a rallying point for military families facing HOA discrimination nationwide. Karen's isolation was total and devastating to watch. Political connections evaporated overnight once the scope of the criminal investigation became clear. Congressman Robert issued a public statement condemning his sister's actions and announcing his complete cooperation with federal investigators. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Businesses refused her service and even her crisis management. Management team quit when they learned about the international crime connections. The federal evidence presented to grand juries was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Financial forensics revealed $600,000 in theft from our community alone. But that was pocket change compared to the millions she'd laundered through various schemes. Bank records showed systematic movement of money from veterans organizations, military family support funds, and HOA accounts into criminal enterprises spanning 3 continents. Rebecca's leadership during this period transformed our entire community in ways that went far beyond just stopping Karen. She organized support networks for military families, coordinated with veteran services organizations, and helped establish legal protections against HOA discrimination. "This isn't just about stopping one criminal," she told a packed town hall meeting. "This is about making sure no military family ever faces this kind of targeting again." Karen's final desperate move showed both her intelligence and her complete disconnection from reality. She attempted to flee the country using a passport with a false identity, but federal agents arrested her at the airport before she could board a flight to a non-extradition country. Her luggage contained over $200,000 in cash and detailed records of her criminal network's operations. Morrison's promotion to head a new federal task force investigating veteran fraud was well-deserved recognition for his integrity throughout the case. "I've never seen anything like this," he told reporters. "The systematic targeting of military families by someone with inside knowledge of how our systems work. It's unprecedented in its scope and cruelty." Community healing began even before Karen's arrest, as neighbors who'd been afraid to speak out finally shared their experiences. Stories emerged of harassment, intimidation, and financial exploitation that painted a picture of domestic terrorism targeting American military families. The FBI later told us that Karen's psychological profile matched terrorists they'd studied, someone who used fear and isolation to control and exploit vulnerable populations. Tyler's livestream during Karen's arrest drew over 200,000 concurrent viewers, making it one of the most watched real-time police actions in social media history. The footage of federal agents reading charges while Karen screamed about political persecution became instant viral content, shared millions of times across platforms as an example of justice finally being served. The charges against Karen were staggering in their scope and severity. 18 federal felonies including money laundering, terrorism financing, elder abuse, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The prosecution estimated that if convicted on all counts, she could face over 200 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Karen's final public outburst as they led her away in handcuffs was captured on Tyler's stream and became the defining moment of her downfall. As federal agents guided her toward their vehicle, she turned to the crowd of neighbors and screamed, something that made Rebecca freeze in shock. "You have no idea what you've done," she shouted. "The people I work with don't forgive, and they don't forget. You military people think you're so special. Wait until they find out who you really are." Tyler's viewers exploded in chat with reactions ranging from shock to horror to dark satisfaction. The comments were flying so fast that nobody could keep up, but the consensus was clear. Karen had just admitted to something that went far beyond neighborhood drama. Rebecca's face went white as she processed the implications of Karen's threat, and I could see her military training kicking in as she assessed potential security risks to our family. Morrison immediately requested additional federal protection for all witnesses in the case, particularly Rebecca and Mrs. Martinez. The threat assessment was classified, but we were told to vary our routines, install additional security measures, and report any unusual activity immediately. Our quiet suburban drama had escalated into a federal security situation. As they cuffed Karen, she screamed something that made Rebecca freeze in shock. Tyler's viewers exploded in chat. "OMG, did she just admit that? What bombshell did Karen just drop that could rewrite everything we know?" Karen's arrest became a media circus unlike anything our quiet neighborhood had ever seen. Federal agents executed the warrant while Tyler live-streamed to his peak audience of 200,000 concurrent viewers. And the footage of her being handcuffed in front of the entire community was both satisfying and surreal. She kept screaming about military conspiracies and political persecution, even as agents read her rights, completely unable to accept that her criminal empire was finally crashing down around her. The bombshell Karen had dropped about her criminal associates not forgiving or forgetting turned out to be even more serious than we'd realized. Federal agents revealed during the security briefing that Karen's threats referenced actual international criminal organizations that had demonstrated willingness to retaliate against witnesses and law enforcement. Rebecca, Mrs. Martinez, Tyler, and I were all placed under federal protection while authorities assessed the credibility of the threats. National media coverage transformed our story from local drama into a symbol of grassroots resistance to corruption. Major networks sent crews to interview residents, and our little neighborhood became the backdrop for serious discussions about military family discrimination, HOA abuse, and the intersection of local corruption with international crime. Tyler found himself being interviewed by real journalists as an expert on citizen journalism and community activism. The victims' impact statements during pre-trial hearings were devastating in their emotional pour. Mrs. Martinez spoke first, and her testimony about the fear, isolation, and financial devastation Karen had caused brought the entire courtroom to tears. "I'm 78 years old," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I survived the death of my husband, raised 5 children as a single mother, and lived through recessions and hardships. But nothing prepared me for the cruelty of someone who would steal from elderly veterans and sleep peacefully at night." Rebecca's testimony was a masterclass in professional presentation and controlled fury. She methodically dismantled Karen's defense strategy by presenting evidence of systematic targeting, psychological manipulation, and deliberate exploitation of military family vulnerabilities. The defendant didn't just commit financial crimes. Rebecca stated she weaponized her knowledge of military culture to inflict maximum psychological damage on families who had already sacrificed for their country. And my statement focused on the educational impact of Karen's harassment campaign and how her actions had affected our entire community's trust in civic institutions. "She didn't just threaten my career," I explained. "She undermined parents' confidence in our school's neighbors' faith in local government and children's belief that adults would protect them from bullies. The damage extends far beyond financial loss." Tyler's evidence compilation had grown into a comprehensive documentary that prosecutors used as their primary exhibit. Months of consistent recording had captured not just Karen's criminal activities, but the psychological impact on victims and the gradual awakening of community resistance. Tyler Wilson's documentation, the lead prosecutor stated, represents the most thorough real-time recording of systematic fraud and harassment ever presented in federal court. Morrison's investigation became the foundation for the prosecution's case, and his testimony about the pattern of military family targeting was particularly damning. "In 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen such systematic psychological warfare conducted against American military families by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their vulnerabilities." He testified, "The defendant's actions constitute domestic terrorism, targeting those who serve our country." The financial forensics presentation was staggering in its scope and complexity. Federal accountants had traced over $8 million through Karen's network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and real estate schemes. The money had flowed from veterans organizations, military family support funds, HOA accounts, and fraudulent government contracts into international criminal enterprises involved in arms trafficking, human trafficking, and terrorism financing. Political testimony revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled Karen's criminal enterprise. Congressman Robert was forced to testify about his role in steering military contracts toward companies controlled by his sister, and his attempts to claim ignorance were demolished by recorded phone conversations and financial records. His political career ended during that testimony, and criminal charges against him were filed the following week. Karen's defense strategy was both predictable and pathetic in its desperation. Her legal team attempted to portray her as a dedicated, community volunteer who'd been targeted by an unhinged military couple seeking revenge for legitimate HOA enforcement actions. They claimed the federal investigation was politically motivated persecution designed to silence conservative voices in local government. The jury's expressions of disgust during these arguments made it clear that nobody was buying the victim narrative. The moment that sealed Karen's fate came when prosecutors played Tyler's recording of her final outburst during arrest. Her threats, about international criminal associates not forgiving witnesses, combined with her admission that she'd been deliberately targeting military families, destroyed any remaining empathy the jury might have had. Even her own lawyers looked stunned by the self-incriminating evidence. Community support during the trial was overwhelming and emotionally moving. Every day of proceedings, the courtroom was packed with neighbors, veterans, military families, and supporters who'd followed the case online. Tyler continued live streaming from outside the courthouse, providing real-time updates to his national audience and maintaining public pressure for justice. Rebecca had become something of a folk hero during this period, appearing on news programs and veterans advocacy platforms to discuss military family rights and HOA reform. Her calm professionalism and obvious expertise made her the perfect spokesperson for systematic change. "This case isn't just about one criminal," she told a national television audience. "It's about protecting military families from predators who would exploit their service and sacrifice." Mrs. Martinez's transformation from frightened victim to community advocate was inspiring to watch. She'd started speaking at veterans events about elder fraud prevention and had become a powerful voice for holding local officials accountable. The dignity and strength she'd shown throughout the ordeal made her a symbol of resilience that resonated far beyond our neighborhood. Legal precedent was being established with every ruling in Karen's case. Federal judges were creating new frameworks for prosecuting systematic discrimination against military families, and civil rights organizations were using the case to push for stronger legal protections. Karen's criminal enterprise had inadvertently catalyzed a national movement for military family advocacy. The scope of victims who came forward during the trial was heartbreaking and infuriating. Military families from across the country testified about similar harassment campaigns they'd faced from HOA officials, landlords, and local government officials who targeted them because of their service. Karen's methods had apparently been copied by other criminals who recognized the vulnerability of frequently moving military families. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution presented evidence that Karen's criminal network had been planning to expand operations to other military communities across the country. Federal agents had intercepted communications discussing replication protocols for her harassment and fraud schemes, revealing that our neighborhood had been a test case for a much larger criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 18 federal charges. Karen's face when the verdict was read showed a mixture of shock, rage, and dawning realization that her privileged life was over forever. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears of relief from victims and supporters who had waited years for justice. But just as the judge raised her gavel to schedule sentencing, Karen's lawyer whispered something that made the judge pause. The entire courtroom held its breath as the judge reviewed whatever document had been presented. The tension was unbearable as we waited to learn what last-minute development could possibly affect Karen's fate. What last-minute revelation could possibly save Karen or make her punishment even worse? The document that Karen's lawyer handed to the judge wasn't some last-minute plea for mercy. Oh no, it was something far more explosive. It was a full confession detailing crimes that prosecutors hadn't even discovered yet. I'm sitting there in the courtroom holding Rebecca's hand, watching the judge's face go from confusion to absolute horror as she read through this thing. Karen had apparently decided that if she was going down, she was taking her entire criminal network with her. And let me tell you, the scope of what that confession revealed was absolutely mind-blowing. Judge Patricia Carter, and I'll never forget her name, because this woman became a hero to military families everywhere. She read that confession with this expression that went from professional neutrality to genuine disgust. Turns out Karen hadn't just been stealing money and harassing military families for kicks. She'd been using her HOA position to gather intelligence about our deployment schedules, security clearances, and classified project assignments, then selling that information to foreign governments. Our neighborhood HOA president had been running a freaking espionage operation disguised as suburban civic engagement. The sentencing hearing turned into something I never could have imagined when this whole nightmare started. Judge Carter delivered this scathing condemnation that addressed not just the money Karen stole from Mrs. Martinez and the rest of us, but the fact that she'd literally committed treason. The defendant has betrayed not just our local community, Judge Carter said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, but potentially every military installation and operation that her victims were connected to. I got chills listening to those words, realizing how close we'd all come to having our security compromised by this woman's greed and hatred. When Judge Carter announced Karen's sentence, 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, plus complete asset forfeit, the courtroom absolutely erupted. People were crying, cheering, hugging strangers, and Tyler's live stream chat was moving so fast it looked like digital confetti. I watched Karen's face crumble as the reality hit her that her privileged life was over forever. 25 years. She'd be in her late 70s when she got out, assuming she lived that long. Justice had been served in the most comprehensive way possible, but the consequences didn't stop with Karen. Oh no. This thing had tentacles that reached all the way to Washington. Congressman Robert got convicted on related charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The mighty Whitfield political dynasty built on corruption and exploitation was completely destroyed. Congressional investigations revealed that their schemes had enabled actual security breaches that put American military personnel at risk for over a decade. New legislation was passed requiring background checks and financial monitoring for anyone with access to military family information. Our community celebration was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. The block party drew over 1,000 people, including veterans, military families, and supporters who traveled from across the country just to be part of our victory. Rebecca and I kept exchanging amazed glances, realizing our local struggle had inspired a national movement for military family protection. Mrs. Martinez was our guest of honor, and when this 78-year-old woman got up to speak, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. I learned that age doesn't matter when standing up for what's right, she said, her voice strong. Rebecca showed me that we don't have to accept bullying from anyone, no matter how powerful they think they are. Sometimes the most important battle is fought in your own backyard. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and even grown Marines were wiping away tears. Rebecca's nonprofit, Military Family Shield, was now operating in 12 states, helping families facing HOA discrimination, landlord harassment, and financial exploitation. Major veterans organizations were throwing their support behind her work, and she had congressional sponsors lined up for new protective legislation. Karen's crime showed us vulnerabilities we didn't know existed, Rebecca explained to a reporter. Now we're working to make sure no military family faces this kind of targeting again. My promotion to superintendent gave me the chance to implement district-wide programs on civic engagement and standing up to corruption. We created a curriculum using our case as a model for community organizing and grassroots resistance. Students across the district were learning that ordinary citizens could hold powerful criminals accountable when they worked together with determination and solid evidence. Some even asked if they could interview us for their government class projects. Morrison's promotion to lead the new Federal Military Family Protection Task Force was well-deserved after everything he'd been through with us. His work now identified over 50 similar criminal operations targeting military communities. The Martinez case opened our eyes to a whole category of crime we hadn't recognized, he testified to Congress. Watching him on C-SPAN speaking about our neighborhood drama in the halls of power was surreal. Tyler's platform exploded to over 500,000 subscribers, and he became a leading voice for citizen journalism and community accountability. Major news organizations featured his work as a prime example of how ordinary people could expose corruption, using nothing but smartphones and determination. He also trained other activists in documentation techniques and legal evidence gathering, turning our accidental victory into a replicable strategy for fighting local corruption. The financial justice aspect was deeply satisfying. Complete asset forfeit from Karen's criminal enterprise funded restitution for all victims, plus compensation for emotional distress and security expenses. Mrs. Martinez didn't just get her stolen $45,000 back. She received enough additional compensation to ensure a comfortable retirement in a beautiful senior community with garden views and 24-hour security. Watching her pack up to move into her new home with dignity restored was one of the most emotional moments of this entire experience. The national legislative impact of our case was extraordinary. The Military Family Protection Act, bossed with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating federal protections against discrimination and severe penalties for anyone who targets military families for exploitation. Civil rights organizations called it the most significant advancement in military family rights in decades. Our little neighborhood HOA drama had literally changed federal law. Karen's final prison interview was a fascinating study in narcissistic delusion and complete lack of accountability. Even facing 25 years in federal prison, she continued claiming that she was the victim of a military conspiracy and political persecution. "I was serving my country by identifying security risks," she told reporters. "Military people think they're above the law and someone has to hold them accountable." The interviewer's expression was priceless, a mix of professional objectivity and barely contained incredulity at her victim narrative. The psychological evaluation for sentencing revealed the truth about Karen's motivation, and it was exactly what Rebecca had suspected from the start. Karen admitted her crimes were driven by revenge against the military institution that had dishonorably discharged her for stealing from soldiers. "Officers like Rebecca get praised, while people like me get blamed," she said. "I wanted to prove they're not special, that they're just as vulnerable as anyone." The pettiness of it was breathtaking. Our community transformation became the lasting legacy of our fight against Karen's criminal empire. We evolved from isolated families into a tight-knit community that actively looked out for each other and resisted corruption. New HOA leadership operated with complete transparency. Financial records posted, online meetings live-streamed, and major decisions required community input. We had permanent safeguards against the kind of abuse Karen had perpetrated. Zero tolerance for discrimination became our community standard, with clear policies protecting military families, elderly residents, and anyone vulnerable to harassment. We created a model that other communities across the country were adopting, turning our painful experience into a blueprint for others. Real estate agents used our community protections as selling points for military families. 2 years after Karen's sentencing, our neighborhood thrived in ways we never imagined when we first moved here. New military families were welcomed with support networks and advocacy resources that would have seemed like fantasy before our experience with Karen. Property values increased as word spread about our strong community protections. Children grew up learning that ordinary people could fight powerful criminals and win an incredible lesson for the next generation. The most satisfying victory was knowing that Karen's attempt to destroy military families had backfired. Instead of driving us away, her crimes had united us and created lasting protections for future generations. Her legacy would be the opposite of what she intended: stronger military family rights, better community protections, and a national network of advocates ready to fight corruption wherever it appeared. Rebecca and I often reflect on how a simple refusal to pay an illegal HOA fee exposed an international criminal conspiracy and turned our lives into a mission to serve military families. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in your own backyard, and ordinary people can change the world when they stand up for what's right. If this story of justice and community triumph inspired you, smash that like button to help us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. This is Echo Stories, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another incredible tale of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Until then, keep standing up for what's right. Thanks for watching.